Formally, good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon, Rotem. I'm happy to have this opportunity um, to allow us to present our work, the works that you lead, Rotem. We did study in self-regulation in the past. Um, and wrote two papers about the concept of enhanced self-regulation. And now we are putting enhanced self-regulation and intermediation together in a new paper which deals with two types of intermediation, monitoring and assurance. And the title of the presentation today is Enhanced Self-Regulation in Digital Governance. As you will see, the presentation deal with the two important legislation of the digital governance in the EU, Digital Service Act and the Artificial AI Act. Both are important, and it's now the time also to present Rotem. Rotem is a postdoc at the Hebrew University. He's also a adjunct lecturer at the Sapir Academic College. He's doing research on digital governance, regulatory intermediation, forms of self-regulation, and he focus on the political economy of delegating regulatory responsibilities in the digital market. So thank you so much, Rotem. You will present, and I will follow from behind. So please go on.
Thank you, David. I will just share the screen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Yes, as David said, I'm going to discuss today the topic of enhanced self-regulation in digital governance and the role we find that intermediation has to play in those regimes, especially regarding monitoring and assurances. So one of the way we're going to structure the lecture today will be in four parts. So we're going to discuss the governance of digital technologies in Europe, but in general, through regulatory intermediation. Then we're going to present our current research project. We're going to draw conclusions and, of course, leave room for Q&A and discussion. So why do we find the governance of digital technologies in Europe and in general to be an interesting topic for academic investigation? So digital technology at the first start are challenging for us. First of all, they challenge the way we think about the protection of fundamental rights, being the right to privacy and data protection, the way we want to protect against discrimination or provide freedom of expression and information, and of course, provide and give consumers and citizens effective remedies when their rights are harmed. But other than that, digital technology are also very harmful sometimes to our health and safety. The AI Act considered that to be address that in digital technology, but every one of us also have computers around us and cell phones that have radio equipment in them that create electromagnetic fields that also can influence and affect our health and safety. So that's one thing that challenges us with digital technologies. They are very much opaque. They are distant. We are talking with companies usually located in the US or Ireland. And those are very complex systems that limits accountability and transparency. They are based on data analytics and predictive models that scholars of different disciplines describe how they allow micro-targeting of services, but also behavioral manipulation, as famously the Cambridge Analytica case has told us. And lastly, what digital technology do, they undermine our understanding of traditional state-centric regulatory strategies. And this is where self-regulation plays a key role, we see much more delegation of responsibility to regulated entities, so forms of self-regulation, even though based on those challenges, we clearly don't trust them to self-regulate themselves, but still we find much more cases and much more different types of self-regulation. The European project and the European approach to digital policy is an interesting case study by itself. It contrasts with the American laissez-faire approach to digital policy and the Chinese statist approach to very state-centric approach to how you regulate digital markets. Scholars tell us that the European digital policy is much more interventionalist. It aims to shape market, mainly the digital single market, the European market, and also projecting their rules beyond the European borders to influence places such as North America, South America, the Middle East, and much beyond that. The literature approached this interventionalist approach by talking about digital sovereignty, the values the European Union tries to embed into their regimes, and the Brussels effect. But sometimes less attention is given to how regulation is actually operationalized. And by that, we're not just talking about the fact that member states delegate authorities and responsibility upward to supranational authorities, but also downwards, not just to regulated entities, but also to regulatory intermediaries, which is the topic of our talk today. And the main question we are trying to solve here or address here is how and mostly why do policymakers delegate responsibilities to those regulatory intermediaries? So what is our research project and what we are interested to understand in it? So our research project is embedded within a broader discussion about self-regulation and polycentrism. This is a topic that doesn't only interest regulatory scholars, it also interests scholars dealing with platform, algorithmic, media, or internet governance. Where they use it, they might change the medium from one topic to another, but the main idea is they use it to frame how power and legitimacy is distributed among actors in the way they govern digital sectors and services. They use self-regulation to offer and explain how it is used to offer proximity, more expertise and flexibility, but also to signal how it lacks legitimacy and how it lacks accountability. And also use the idea of polycentrism to capture the way that there are several overlapping points of decision making without one single decision maker or regulator or arbiter. And in this kind of framework, we are trying to find the role regulatory intermediaries play. And so what are those actors? What are those intermediaries? What are their role within self-regulation? So intermediaries are a very interesting group of actors. They are located between the regulators, the one that set the standards and monitor them and enforce the rules, and the rule takers, the one that those standards and regulatory actions supposed to influence their behaviors. They are locating the space between those actors. They might create and organize frameworks for standards or understanding how to interpret those standards. They might voice or do advocacy, meaning they might raise issues from different actors to the agenda level in order to influence future regulation. They might be involved in implementation and coordination, meaning they might do training schemes or help actors better understand how they can work together to manage the regulatory space. And when we say an self-regulation, we usually use that to explain how intermediaries, those actors that occupy the space between rule takers and regulators, are used in order to make self-regulation more credible, more legitimate, but also much more polycentric in the way regulation and governance can be understood. In our project, we are focused and identify two pathways for enhancing self-regulation. The first is assurances. So what is assurances? The literature explains that this is an independent, evidence-based assessment to enhance confidence and trust. And the core self-regulatory obligation in every enhanced self-regulation, there is supposed to be a core basis of self-regulation, and that role is to demonstrate conformity with regulatory requirements. And the way it is being done, the way you present your accountability is through traceability, formal reviews, standards that can be used here as well, but mostly document compliance. You have to document basically everything you do in order to show that later on. And the core role of intermediaries in that space is to assess, verify, and attest conformity with those rules. Meanwhile, monitoring is much more about generating information in a systematic way about compliance and risks. The role task of self-regulated entities is to govern their conduct and risk and decisions over time, but the way they do that is much more by visibility, by transparency, by contestation of what they do. So managing complaints, for example, repeated scrutiny, and by that correct their behavior. And the role of intermediaries will be much more about generating information, analyzing it, validating that information, and provide scrutiny. One key difference here is that monitoring can be used later on for providing assurances, but it's much less judgment laden. It talks about less about actually making judgment about the actual conformity. And so what we are asking here is a very kind of interesting question. We see those two legislation that David mentioned earlier, the Digital Services Act and Artificial Intelligence Act. We see a much more interventionalist Europe, where it attempts to adopt those two very comprehensive, very strong forms of regulation, embed them within an end self-regulation, yet they diverge. The AI Act relies much more on providing assurances, whereas the DSA deals much more with providing monitoring. So what we are basically asking is, first of all, what is the policy process that shape and end self-regulation within each of those regimes? How do they differ, and why are those differences important? And thirdly, so what can explain both the shared reliance on an end self-regulation, but then this divergence between these two forms of an end self-regulation? We do it through a most similar system design of those two legislations that we identify and then self-regulation in them. They have the shared objectives. They deal with major and big tech companies that are very powerful. They both try to respond to the limitation and limited capacity of public regulators, and they both rely on rule takers to self-regulate themselves. They have a very shared context. They are both adopted under the same policy cycle, starting with the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, political guidelines. They are negotiated mostly under the same council presidencies, meaning the Slovenian and French presidencies of the council, and they both deal with risk-based logic, protection of fundamental rights, and innovation. But as we mentioned, they are there's differences. One is much more about assurances, and the DSA is much more about monitoring. And this shared context allows us to control for macro factors and develop explanation and hypotheses based on ideas, interests, and institutions. What is the data set? So we gathered about 366 policy-related documents through Freedom of Information request, the Parliament repository for legislation, and civil society website. We used process tracing from the political guidelines of the Commission presidency until adoption of the legislation. And the idea is to provide a political economy account of regulatory intermediation in digital governance in Europe, but of course also beyond it. A little bit of European legislation 101. So the way European legislation works is that the Commission is the only institution that is allowed to offer legislation, propose legislations. When it does that, it also publishes an impact assessment, which is its explanation of why it decided this specific policy intervention approach. This proposal then is sent to the two legislative bodies. One is the European Parliament that represents the citizens of the European Union, and the Council of the European Union that represent the government. Each of them will take the proposal through their committees, will adapt it and change it based on what they understand need to be amended. And then we have those three versions of the same legislation. Representatives of those bodies will meet together to something called a trialogue. They will then discuss and try to adopt a finalized version that the Parliament and the Council would then have to approve. And this process, that policy process, we try to follow through in the research and understand how it works. So what do we find when we look at the first research questions of how an answer of regulation emerged in both acts? So we find that both acts were shaped by the Commission and Council and Parliament negotiation, but they went through distinct paths. In the AI Act, the Commission framed the issues around product safety and conformity logic. They wanted to benefit from the standardization framework and build upon the new legislative framework. It helped them very much shape how policy problems were framed in their discussions. Interestingly, Council delegates, members of the Parliament, and European institutions called for reliance on regulatory intermediaries. They pushed it, but in the end, those calls were filtered out in the process, mainly because in the Council there was disagreement whether to rely on first-party assessment as the Commission proposed, or to rely on intermediaries. In the Parliament, there was a very strong push to rely on third-party regulatory intermediaries, but in the end, before the trialogue, the Parliament actually take a step back. It much more restrained, adopt a much more restrained approach, and decides not to push ahead with the idea of relying on intermediaries. And so in the end, self-assessment, as the Commission originally proposed, was the default assurance model. The Commission explained in one of the recital of the regulation that the reason for that is that the notified body, that the regulatory intermediaries, don't have enough capacity to basically assess at the current point the conformity assessment and the risks, and so they wanted to rely on self-assessment. The DSA is a completely different point. We see there that the issues are framed around platform government reform and addressing information asymmetries and systemic risk. Mainly, we can see that as much as the platform offer more risk, the European Union wants to have more obligation, more due diligence obligation. At the top of that escalating obligation, we find the very large online social networks and the online platform and the search engines. And they identified the very important information asymmetries between them and how they offer systemic risk. But even though they want to do a reform, they look at the e-commerce directive, the legislation that came before it, and want still to keep core concept from it, especially the ban on general monitoring of illegal content and the ex-ante ban on ex-ante monitoring and censorship. Interestingly, both delegates of the council and the members of parliament largely accept this idea of to rely on regulatory intermediaries. They are shared the view with the commission. And so what they are left with, given the fact that they already agree with the idea to rely on them, is first order adjustments. So they just make sure that they agree with that, with how to regulate intermediaries. Only members of parliament that are on the extreme right actually ask to delete the entire provision dealing with specific groups of intermediaries. But there's a clear consensus of relying on them. So what do we see when we compare the overall results? We see that the AI Act relies on assurances. The idea is that regulated entities will demonstrate conformity before market entry and across the life cycle of developing AI systems and implement them, of course. The intermediary's role is to verify and attest conformity. The main actors, main intermediaries are the notified conformity assessment bodies. They are supposed, according to the Commission, to assess approximately 5 to 15% of the market and make sure that they comply with the requirements set by the AI Act. Next to them, we find national accreditation bodies. They are supposed to make sure that the notified bodies actually have the knowledge and institutional capacity to assess conformity, and liability insurers that are supposed to make sure that once those notified bodies actually assess conformity, that they don't take too many risks in actually assessing them, that our risks are being insured. Interestingly, the AI Act delegates to those intermediaries a very authoritative discretion, meaning their decisions regarding conformity affect the market access for digital and high-risk AI systems. They don't have to go back to the regulators to approve their decisions. Their decisions are automatically impact our services exist in the market. And if they decide to withdraw their certification or limit it, that automatically affects the systems that exist in the market. How does the state regulate them? They designate the notified bodies, they accredit them, and provide oversight. And the Commission, meanwhile, and the European bodies, supposed to coordinate and steer these regimes by requesting standards, investing money, coordinating the notified bodies in a designated group, and manage the registry for high-risk AI. The AI board and the AI office have several other tasks in the AI Act, but when it comes to high-risk AI, they mostly do harmonization across the regulators. DSA, we see a monitoring approach. Regulated entities must govern their conduct and risk and decisions over time. But unlike the AI Act, we don't have that market entry knowledge that they confirm with the DSA at entry point. So it's much more ex-post regulation. The intermediaries do much more work of information generation and scrutiny. We can find three groups of intermediaries working simultaneously. Flaggers flag content that they identified as illegitimate or problematic, and create reports on systematic violations. Researchers, academics can get access through the regulators to the systems and offer publications on identifying systemic risk. And auditors work here on two pathways. Very large online platforms and search engines must do annual independent audits every year. And so they have to be independent, but also the commission can rely on auditors. And for the commission, auditors don't have to be independent. What they do, they create information, they flag risk, they collect data, but the discretion is not assigned to them, it's not delegated to them, it's left with the regulated entities and the regulators. What do the regulator do? They vet flaggers and researchers. You cannot be a trusted flagger or vetted researchers without state's approval. They also assess auditors' independence and competence by reading the reports that they created. Additionally, they can request information not just from the platforms or the search engines, but also from the auditors. And interestingly, if they find that the auditor misrepresents information, for example, they can actually issue fines to the auditors. The commission has similar powers over auditors, but it also is in charge with regulating those very large platforms and search engines. But it also steers, it also builds European expertise and capacities, where the board is more about coordinating the regulators and issuing opinions. So why do we find that the both acts rely on net self-regulation yet vary? We develop four hypotheses to explain that. First of all, we rely on additional scholars that explain that French dirigiste ideas of state intervention influence digital policymaking in Europe. It helps policymakers to frame policy problem, the role of the states, and the choice between different policy instruments, including function under an self-regulation. Historical institutionalism, we try to understand whether or not legacy framework shape regulation and channel the way the delegation of responsibility are assigned to intermediaries. We wonder about interest groups, whether big tech, for example, influence and shape regulation, trying to avoid unfavorable regulatory requirements, including by way of relying on intermediaries. And lastly, a functional explanation whether or not intermediary is actually the best and most effective way a policy instrument to achieve the policy goals that the policymakers are setting for themselves. What do we find here? We find that both acts are influenced by digital dirigism. We see a clear shift from of the European digital policy and digital governance from market enabling, from neoliberal concept of voluntary self-regulation to regulated form of an self-regulation under European steering, and very much so the empowerment of the member states to regulate and supervise digital services. This helps them shape and frame the problems they identified, whether it be systemic risks and asymmetric information in the DSA, or the issue of trust in the AI Act. But what more clearly explains the variation is the path dependencies. In the DSA, it's clear that yes, they wanted to do a comprehensive reform of the e-commerce directive, but there are still clear legacies there, which are mainly the general ban on monitoring, as well as the idea that you don't do ex ante monitoring and basically censorship. So that shift the entire idea of intermediation to be exposed, not only after the services enter the market, only after content is being published, not beforehand. Meanwhile, the AI Act is very much influenced by the new legislative framework, legacy, because it permits, what it does, it permits the European Union to rely on product safety logic, on standardization, but it also brings with it the reliance on very powerful third-party assessment by the notified bodies. And what the European Union attempts to do in the policy process, as we see in the first answer to the first question, is that it tried to maneuver and not to rely on it. So it basically attempted to filter out and defaulting on first party assessment instead of third party assessment. Does the interest group dynamics influence it? We came and we thought, yes, in the DSA, big tech is a major issue that we are trying to manage, especially very large social media and search engines, but it's not very much represented in the discussions around the AI Act. When you look on the discussion, they're very much more afraid of law enforcement than big tech. So the sectors there described are not described as something they have to worry from big tech. But they do want to protect small and medium enterprises as an interest group, but only in the margins. And by that, we mean if you are a small and medium enterprise, you will get exemption under the DSA, you will get support under the AI Act. But if you develop a very high-risk AI system or a very large, for example, platform, you won't be exempt. You will have to follow through on all the requirements. So it's only in the margins. And clearly, in the DSA, yes, intermediation is the preferred method. There is consensus among policymakers that that's the right approach, but it's not the same case with the AI Act. They default on self-assessment and clearly don't see notified body as in the current form as the main issue to address. So what are the conclusions we draw from all of this? Why it matters? Because it confirms a shift to interventionalist and self-regulation, self-governances under state supervision and European steering. We see very much a politics of intermediation. Intermediation is politically constructed. The European Union tried to build capacities. They selectively empowered experts. AI Act is much more about expertise in institutions. DSA is more about expertise in epistemic intermediaries, so academics and auditors and civil society. But then when it comes to the protection of other forms of intermediation, for example, content moderation, this is where you see dilution of safeguard. A famous case is the German NetzDG Act that was supposed to protect intermediaries, content moderators, was actually cancelled because of the DSA, and currently there's only the transparency requirement. It's no longer actual protections. And we use this to set a research agenda around polycentric governance, thinking about not just about points of decision-making as Ostrom thinks about it, but also through the nodes of intermediation within those networks and the polycentric governance regimes. And we ask that future work would test those findings and patterns in other domains, digital or not, and also check and examine effects on accountability, effectiveness, and legitimacy. And that will be it for this lecture. So we are both looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rotem. Let me take out the presentation, and then we all see each other. So questions comments, please? Yes, Eti, please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I like that the paper moves beyond identifying who the intermediaries are and focuses instead on what intermediaries actually do. And looking at the comparison, I was wondering the distinction is also related to different forms of delegated authority. I mean, in the AI Act, intermediaries seem able to issue authoritative judgments, and in the DSA, they mainly generate information for others. Do you see this as a distinction between different forms of authority, or mainly between different regulatory functions?
Thank you. Rotem, do you want to answer this one?
Well, basically, yeah, I think so there's different in form and then in delegation of discretion, because you can do an assurance model that rely on just auditing. For example, you don't have to actually delegate actual authoritative discretion to intermediaries. You can say just create a seal or a certificate and publish it alongside something, but it doesn't mean, or a ranking, for example, of things, and that only provides information without actually having clear discretion about how something will enter or leave the market. But so they could have chosen that path in the AI Act and try to resemble more digital services in the DSA kind of manner, but they haven't done so. They went much more powerfully into the delegation of actual authoritative discretion to the intermediaries, which that got kind of a different form of discretion assigned to them.
Yeah. I see Marcus' hand, but let me just say, do one comment before Marcus. You don't have necessarily to react, Autumn. So we have a few forms of intermediation. We have monitoring here, as well as assurance function, different type of actors. And Ophir is working on yet another type of actor. This is financial actors that have to report financial suspicious transfer of money, or so this is the money laundering case. And for you, Eti, this is probably an agency, independent agency, or a separate agency entity that doing higher education quality verification, quality ranking, and so on. So we identify more and more function in this arena. And the question for us in the digital sphere is to identify the most important ones and to explain them. And we did one step with this study focusing on assurance and monitoring as to intermediation mechanisms. It's more about intermediation mechanism than intermediaries as actors. What do I mean by mechanism? Assurance is a mechanism. It's a package of action which leads you to a more control digital sphere. And even monitoring is doing similar thing. It's a form of control on the digital sphere, but only with monitoring, more modest, more thin, apparently. And with you, it's measurement, Etty, and with Ophir, it's reporting, right? You have to report. Now, Marcus, please. Yes, but you have to. Yes, now it should be good.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very well presented and most interesting. I particularly liked your diagram of the actors, which I think was very clear and very well done. My question is probably a little bit out of the box, but I see one of the major intermediaries who should be, but is not present in your actors, are actually the end users, the consumers. And a lot of the work the Commission is doing today is to try and more involve citizens in the activities of the Commission. Did you find anywhere where user groups acting to control the digital marketplace, activists became an intermediary who anyone would take any attention, may pay any attention to, or is this a pipe dream?
Thank you. So we haven't looked at this in current research, but both, first of all, the GDPR and then the DSA as well empowers much more civil society and civil advocacy groups, mainly by, yes, empowering citizens or consumers, depending on the relevant sectors and how we define the beneficiaries. So empowering them by assigning them, giving them rights and the ability to fight for their rights usually in courts, but in other forms as well. For example, in front of the regulator, but they also are allowed often to assign those rights to the civil advocates. So that's a topic we didn't cover here, but because the groups of civil society or civil advocacy groups we kind of focus here are much more about the trusted flaggers, which is much more about monitoring than actually going to court and providing advocacy. And that's one group. The other form is also in the AI Act, they try to make sure they will be much more representative in developing standards, for example. So civil society are not like formal advocacy, but more about bringing the voice of consumers and other groups through civil actors to standardization bodies, which often do not represent civil society, but only do so within the European context of how a European standard should be developed. And so those were kind of the places where one might find regulatory intermediaries working in more in the advocacy role, I guess.
But there's no formal process whereby the people who are most impacted by the bad things that these products are doing have a say in as part of the regulatory process. Am I correct in saying that?
So yes and no. So it's mostly post things. So it's mostly once the product is in the market, once the product is found to be infringing, mostly exposed. In legislation, there is an option for there's always a place where the European Commission publish a white paper, and then it asks for people to voice their thoughts about the proposal they are offering to make. But once the proposal is actually initiated, usually it goes straight to the institution, and citizens or consumers that have less room to influence the development unless they use lobby forms of influence. And yes, once the product in the market, only where, or the service in the market, only where there's infringement, they might go to the regulator or the courts. But that will mostly would be exposed, not as part of the process itself. So it's often exposed. So it's there's a very clear gap in the middle of how things might develop in legislation that can be probably better improved when it comes to consumers.
Thank you.
So from my perspective, the issue of user empowerment is a valid form of intermediation. Says that there is public authority who allow or encourage users to report, complain, or to participate in governance. But there should be, in order for these mechanisms of governance to be effective, this should be institutionalized, and the participation or the reporting should be governed and empowered in a way that will make a difference. To some extent, this is a kind of a neoliberal approach. Yes, the state will not regulate; it will allow user to complain after the fact. But we also see user empowerment as the duty to report. It's not user empowerment; it's user responsibilization. You have to report on abuse. It's not an option. You must, and it might be criminally detected. Yeah, thank you. And Ophir, I see you are the next.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting, and feel like I've learned a lot, and I will rewatch it again to learn the part that I didn't fully understand. I have two questions that I hope will be also useful, but also interest me. The first one is, if I'm not wrong, there are not many, if at all, AI companies that are sitting in Europe, in European countries. So maybe it can affect their ability to operate as interest groups or object certain regulation that they find more heavy, as opposed to e-commerce groups that I believe that there are more of in Europe. And the second one that I think it's more interesting is that of course, by watching the media and the European governments in Europe and how they talk about AI, it seems that they are more hesitant than the United States or even Israel about the influence of AI. So could it be possible that maybe because they don't trust the AI companies or AI platforms, they want to give the intermediaries more power over them, even if the cost will be to unauthorized certain AI platforms from working within Europe.
Thank you for this comment. So regarding the first one, interestingly, some statistics say that about 90% of the European Union is small and medium enterprises, right? It's mostly very small, up to 50 employees per company. So it's not very big, even though you can think of very large companies that are European and have AI. The kind of clear examples are Siemens or Philips or SAP or Spotify that do use AI in different capacity, not always high risk. When it comes to medical devices, they're often high risk, but not always. So that kind of logic of the fact that most companies are in Europe are generally small, often leads how they approach the regulation of technologies, and much more concerned about non-European companies being American or Chinese, and their attempt to align them with the European way of doing things and how to regulate sectors. So yeah, that's kind of the dynamics it often have to manage in this kind of approach of how they do regulation. And I think so it also impacts that whether or not they trust companies. Again, if your mindset is that you're most of the big and risky companies are not European, you might have more distrust in them, and you might trust more or smaller companies, or might not think they are as risky as they might be because they're quite small, and you just want to help them grow. That might lead your way of thinking of whether you trust them or not. But at the same time, the European Commission just published a week ago a very big, comprehensive digital policy strategy, trying to figure out how to increase investment in AI, in data centers in Europe. So they do want to bring more development and more things to Europe, and not rely on those external companies that might be distrustful. So again, it might be a kind of a way of how they think of things, including not just AI, also basic communications, bringing everything to Europe, develop them in Europe, so they can trust them more being under European sovereignty rather than non-European sovereignty of other countries. Well,
Thank you.
Excellent. And more comments? If not, we will end here. And I will say thank you so much for your participation. I will stop the recording and see you in the next webinar.